Anyway, over to Alban.
I'll say hello to my friend Astrid, who's there, and anybody else who I know out there. And did you want to introduce next week, or shall I kick off?
I think Fiona's.
Martin's not here.
Right. Okay. So,
as far as I'm aware, it's Victorian art on the River Thames.
Right.
Right. If everyone
could on the River Thames.
If everyone could mute themselves, please. So I don't have to do it.
The honours. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome to Charles Dickens, the novels, the novelist in the 19th century, which I'm going to try and do within an hour. And if I end up stopping mid, it's because the hour is up. The topic is going to be this gentleman. Unfortunately, it's I need to press this button rather than that one. Okay, the topic is going to be this gentleman who you may recognize. He's on his mobile phone, getting younger and younger by the day. That's not a photograph, that one is. And losing his beard, of course, and getting younger and younger, becoming a Regency dandy until he becomes an 18-year-old boy, and then a child, and then a baby. I have to admit I'm cheating a bit because the baby picture isn't him, and the boy is his son, Charles Culliford Boz, rather than he himself. But what I'm going to try and do is to talk about Charles Dickens' 16 parts. That's 15 novels and a bit about his Christmas Carol, and talk about his life and talk about the 19th century. So I'll better get on with this pretty quickly. So the first of his novels was Pickwick Papers. It's the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club, which burst onto the reading public on the 30th of March, 1836. Dickens had made his name as the writer of comical sketches on the newspaper for which he was working as a parliamentary reporter, and had been asked to write the script to accompany a series of sporting plates by the well-known illustrator Robert Seymour. Soon, though, the young author's comic tales outgrew the sporting plates they were supposed to illustrate. Over a period of 20 monthly installments, the stories of the balding, bespectacled, chubby, genial, but accident-prone Mr. Samuel Pickwick and his travelling companions, Mr. Winkle, Mr. Snodgrass, Mr. Tupman, captured the nation's imagination. And it became a real publishing phenomenon when the original chirpy Cockney East Ender, Sam Weller, was introduced. His name would be found on a plethora of joke books, figurines, and cigars and songbooks. It was published under the pseudonym Boz, which Dickens has used for his earlier newspaper stories. The name came from the teasing he gave to his youngest brother, called Augustus, who as a child couldn't pronounce the name Moses, a character in a favourite book, Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield. He also pronounced it Bose, and Dickens liked the name. I have a friend whose name is Tootie from her childhood days, even though that's not her real name. Bose is always associated with his illustrator friend Hablot K. Brown, who was nicknamed Fizz. But the first few months of illustrations were done by the illustrator Robert Seymour, who was well established, and Dickens had originally been appointed only as someone to put words to his pictures. But the 24-year-old was not going to play second fiddle to anyone. And so on the 18th of April, 1836, Dickens called a meeting with Seymour in which he criticised his work. 2 days later, Seymour went into the summer house of his garden in Islington, set up his gun with a string on its trigger, and shot himself in the head, dead. The picture of the cricket match, which appeared on the £10 note, was by Robert William Buss, the artist who followed him and would later paint Dickens' Dream, but Dickens found fault with him as well before choosing Hablot K. Brown to complete the novel's illustrations. So that's one down. Oliver Twist. Such was the success of Pickwick Papers that Dickens began his second novel, Oliver Twist, while the first novel was still being serialised. As a parliamentary reporter, he had come into contact with the changes in support for the poor, which had led to the establishment of the workhouse system under the new Poor Law of 1834, which divided families and tried to shame and in many cases starve the inmates back to work. They were no better than prisons for the poor. Oliver Twist was his response. And everybody can recognise Oliver Twist just from pictures like that, or even from the famous David Lean 1948 film, which follows the parish boy's progress, the subtitle of the novel, from the workhouse to Fagin's gang to his rescue by Mr. Brownlow and the restoration of his rightful inheritance. Charles John Huffam Dickens himself was not born in a workhouse, but in the house shown here in the Portsmouth suburb of Portsea, which is on the south coast. At the time, it was surrounded by fields. It was the 7th of February 1812, and his father, shown here, had recently acquired a well-paid job at £200 a year as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office. The site of this pay office is now obscured by the modern building which is used to display the Mary Rose in the Portsmouth dockyard, which is just behind Nelson's flagship Victory, which is displayed here. Elizabeth Barrow, Dickens' mother, had come from the family of a disgraced Navy paymaster who had fled the continent after embezzling money, while John Dickens' parents were still in service in a large house in Cheshire. He always liked to think that he was his father by the Lord. Later, John Dickens would become the model for the spendthrift but likeable Mr. Micawber, while his mother was less kindly portrayed as the empty-headed Mrs. Nickleby. After several moves within Portsmouth and a short spell in London, the family settled in 2 Ordnance Terrace in the Kent naval port of Chatham, where the family grew. It's on the southeast coast of Britain. The picture is of his elder sister Fanny. Dickens looked back on these years between 1817 and 1822 as the happiest of his young life. On his long walks with his father, he would have seen the prison hulks anchored in the Medway, the church of St. James at Coolidge with its characteristic lozenge-shaped gravestones, and the big house on Gad's Hill. His father told him that if he worked hard, a house such as that could be his one day, and so it proved to be. And what of the original Bowes, his youngest brother Augustus? Well, he grew up, he married Harriet Lovell, and he then ran off to America with another woman, Bertha Phillips, when his first wife began to go blind. He, his second wife, though they never married, and their 3 children are buried in the Graceland Cemetery, Chicago, where he had settled. Dickens would continue to support his brother's 2 widows financially until the end of their lives. The third novel he wrote is Nicholas Nickleby. It's the early school scenes that most people remember from this novel, with the abused schoolboy Smike, rescued by the new young teacher Nicholas Nickleby, seen here turning his own cane on Wackford Squeers. What a great name. It's also a story of the unmasking of the villainous wicked Uncle Ralph, the theatre of Mr. Crummles, and the kind-hearted Cheeryble brothers, one of whom marries Nicholas's sister, Kate. The year before Shaw's 1823 prosecution saw the Dickens family leaving Chatham for London. The 10-year-old, sorry, that's the picture of William Shaw. Now, he's the one who, in 1838, he and Dickens, that's Hablot K. Brown and Dickens, had travelled north by stagecoach together to investigate the notorious boarding schools of the age. Here they found the original for Do the Boys Hall at Bowes Hall Academy, pictured here, and its notoriously sadistic headmaster, William Shaw, who was the original for the delightfully named Wackford Squeers. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favour of 2. William Shaw had been prosecuted for cruelty and neglect in 1823, when 2 of his pupils went blind due to the poor conditions and lack of hygiene at the school. Dickens met Shaw on the 2nd of February, so he was still in place as a headmaster. The contemporary advertisement for a similar school where there were no vacations, where the children stayed there all the time, is on the left here. So they existed. So, yeah, so it's the early school scene most people remember, the abused schoolboy Smike rescued by the new young teacher Nicholas Nickleby. London in 1822, the year before William Shaw's 1823 prosecution, saw the Dickens family leaving Chatham for London. The 10-year-old Charles, having stayed behind to finish the term at Mr. Giles's school, travelled alone and remembered being packed in damp straw and forwarded like game carriage paid. The house he came to in Bayham Street, Camden, was in one of the poorest parts of London, but they would soon be on the move again, as his father, like Mr. Micawber and David Copperfield, moved from place to place in a vain attempt to avoid the creditors. Eventually, they caught up with him. So on the 20th of February, 1824, John Dickens, like William Dorrit and Wilkins Micawber, was incarcerated in the debtors' prison at the Marshalsea in Southwark. While the family took lodgings nearby and his sister Fanny was allowed to continue her music education, the 12-year-old Charles, lodging alone, was taken out of school and set to work. And he was set to work at Warren's blacking factory, which is there. Warren's blacking factory was situated on the banks of the stinking Thames. And like David Copperfield, young Charles spent the day in menial factory work, in his case, labeling bottles of blacking for polishing boots. Today, it's no more, but its location is very near to the Embankment tube station. Later, they moved him to Chandos Street. They must have thought he looked the part, where he was required to do the same job at an open window where passing strangers could gawp at him. He was only here for about 3 months, but it was something that was to affect him for the rest of his life. His mother had wanted to keep him working there longer, something for which he never forgave her. Now, he kept the secret of this shameful episode even from his own family, but wrote down for his friend John Foster what has become known as the autobiographical fragment for his biography, not published until 1872, 2 years after Dickens' death. This contained the following heartfelt admission of the pain of rejection he felt at the time. "It is wonderful to me how I could have been so easily cast away at such an age. It is wonderful to me that even after my descent into the poor little drudge I had been since we came to London, no one had compassion enough for me." And then at the end, "My father and mother were quite satisfied. They could hardly have been more so if I had been 20 years of age, distinguished at a grammar school and going to Cambridge." And he also wrote, which isn't there, "My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and wander desolately back to that time of my life." And there was, of course, nothing unusual about the employment and harsh treatment of children in Victorian times. Children under 9 were still allowed to work in factories for 12 hours a day until 1833. Child chimney sweepers were legal until the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1840, though even after that date, they were a common sight as the law wasn't enforced. And it was only with the Mines Act of 1842 that children as young as 6 were prevented from being employed dragging coal through tunnels too small for a grown man. What was unusual was that they should have had such a vociferous champion in the person of Charles Dickens, who wrote in Great Expectations, "In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice." This is why his novels are filled with oppressed children. Here, David Copperfield about to be beaten by Mr. Murdstone, Tom and Louisa Gradgrind denied the imaginative entertainment of the circus in Hard Times, Joe the crossing sweeper in Bleak House, Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, Little Nell from The Old Curiosity Shop, Oliver Twist and Pip from Great Expectations, as well as the children we've seen already from Do the Boys Hall. And perhaps my favourite child victim, here's the Marchioness from the next novel we're going to look at, abused by a mistress, but saved by the reformed character Dick Swiveller. His fourth novel. By 1840, Dickens' star was so in the ascendant that he could publish his next 2 novels in Master Humphrey's Clock, a literary magazine he was now editing. It tells the story of little Nell and her grandfather, who, having lost his ownership of his shop, has a nervous breakdown and goes off wandering the countryside with his granddaughter, not yet 14, for fear of being locked up as insane. Here she's captured in Holman Hunt's painting of 1847, and again on the right-hand side by Robert Braithwaite Martineau in 1852, when she's teaching the boy Kit to read and write. The novel contains also some of the most visual and visceral descriptions of the newly emerging industrial landscape that Dickens and Havelock K. Brown had witnessed in their journey through the Midlands, and which Nell and her grandfather encounter in the novel. Here is Dickens' description. Again, because at the time, I'll just read the bit in bright yellow. "Strange engines spun and writhed like tortured creatures, clanking their iron chains, shrieking in their rapid whirl from time to time, as though in torment unendurable, and making the ground tremble with their agonies. Men, women, and children, wan in their looks and ragged in attire, tended the engines and fed their tributary fire, begged upon the road, or scowled half naked from the doorless houses." The Old Curiosity Shop was a very, very popular book, But it was the fate of little Nell, young, beautiful and good, whom God had numbered among his angels at an early age, that was to become the literary sensation of the age. So popular had the serialized novel become that New York readers stormed the wharf when the ship bearing the final installment arrived in 1841. In Boston Harbor, boats rowed out to inquire if little Nell was still alive and returned with black flags when they received the sad news that she wasn't. And even the great liberator, Daniel O'Connell, on the left there, was so moved by her death that he was on the train at the time and he threw his copy of the magazine out of his train window in a fit of despair. And in the village of Tong in Shropshire, the verger of St. Bartholomew's Church made an entry in the Book of the Dead and set up a sign showing where she was buried. It was visited by thousands and is still there today. I've been there. Oscar Wilde on the top right there was also expressed his deep emotions about the death of little Nell when he said, "One would have to have a heart of stone to read the death of little Nell without laughing." The Victorians certainly knew how to do a bedroom scene, but more often than not, it's the deathbed rather than the lover's bed that they were most moved by. If little Nell is the most memorable character from the Old Curiosity Shop, then the malicious, grotesquely deformed hunchback dwarf moneylender Daniel Quilp comes a close second. Quilp is in a long line of Dickens' memorable villains, some pure evil schemers like Tulkinghorn from Bleak House or the brutish Bill Sikes from Oliver Twist, some slimy hypocrites like Seth Pecksniff in Martin Chuzzlewit or Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, and some grotesque caricatures like Grandfather Smallweed in Bleak House, Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, and Fagin in Oliver Twist. For modern readers, the Jewish stereotyping makes for uncomfortable reading. Dickens sadly reflects the prejudices of his times, though he did tone down the description of Fagin as a loathsome reptile in later editions and did introduce an heroic Jewish character, the saintly and gentle Mr. Ryer, in Our Mutual Friend, as a response and an apology to the objections of the Jewish community he had received. Dickens was not adverse to change a character mid-novel, as happened with the case of the dwarf Miss Moucher in David Copperfield, when he received a complaint from the real-life individual, Jane Seymour Hill, on which she was based, and she then becomes an heroic character. The fifth novel was Barnaby Rudge. Dickens now thought that, like Scott, he would try his hand at an historical novel, this one set during the time of the Gordon riots of 1780. For the first time, his efforts did not get the response from the reading public he'd expected. Sales plunged from 100,000 for the Old Curiosity Shop to 70,000 for the novel's first edition and 30,000 by the end. But the novel is not without its interest. The eponymous hero is an innocent, simple-minded, but very likable individual, most memorable for the pet raven he takes with him everywhere. Grip was based on the talking raven Dickens himself kept as a pet, along with a menagerie of several dogs, cats, and other birds. One person who enjoyed Barnaby Rudge was the American master of the Gothic, Edgar Allan Poe. I don't suppose any of you have ever heard of him, who was inspired by Dickens' example to give a prominent place to a raven in his poem of that same name. He was later to meet Dickens when he came to America in 1842. Although Poe is nevermore, Dickens' stuffed raven survives in the Free Library of Philadelphia, acquired by auction after Dickens' death, and sitting alongside the only copy of the raven in Poe's own hand. Less well known and perhaps less notable, perhaps, is that the heroine of the novel, Dolly Varden, had a trout named after her, which I think is possibly a compliment. But what was Dickens doing in 1841? Where was he? In 1836, he had married Catherine Hogarth, the daughter of the Scottish lawyer, music critic, and later in 1835, editor of the Evening Chronicle. Catherine had not been his first love. That had been Mary Beadnell, whom he had fallen madly in love with as an 18-year-old. He was scorned both by her father, who regarded his impecunious reporter as someone with no prospects at all, and by Mary herself, who rejected him as a mere boy. She was 2 years his senior, at his 21st coming of age party. He was heartbroken. What a mistake to make her, though. He was living by 1841 in 1 Devonshire Terrace, Regent's Park, London. The house on the left, which demolished in the 1950s to make way for an ugly yellow brick and glass office block with the plaque showing Dickens' characters, including Barnaby Rudge and Grip. In January 1837, they had moved into 48 Doughty Street, now the Dickens Museum, which is the house in the middle of the three pictures. With them was his young wife's younger sister, Mary Hogarth, who had come to help run the home after the birth of their first child. She was 17, pretty and good company. One night, after returning from the theatre with his two petticoats, as he called them, one on each arm, Dickens walked upstairs behind her, the stairs you see there, only to see her fall back. He carried her upstairs to the bed, which is shown here, and she died in the early hours of the morning in his arms. He was overcome with grief, wanted to be buried with her when he died, though that didn't come off, and recreated her image in such young and beautiful characters as Rose Maylie in Oliver Twist. He wore her ring for the rest of his life and named his next child, Mary, after her. His sixth novel was Martin Chuzzlewit. It's again memorable for its characterization, if not for its plot line. There's the Seth Pecksniff, the simpering architect who oozes insincerity, shown here in typical pose, and his two daughters who are named Charity and Mercy and who represent anything but. There's Mrs. Gamp, the unscrupulous, drunken and garrulous snuff-taking nurse after whom an umbrella was named, whose nursing leaves a lot to be desired. Her famous line, "Ah," said Mrs. Gamp, walking away from the bed, "oh, he'd make a lovely corpse," suggesting a less than optimistic assessment of the charges she was asked to look after. The plot line revolves around the eponymous hero, a 21-year-old trainee architect who seeks his fortune with his cheerful companion in the United States. The purchase of a plot of land called Eden in a malarial swamp proves a less than successful investment, and they return to England. The quote here describes him setting out optimistically on his journey to the New World from Liverpool and mirrors the experience of Dickens a year earlier, as does Martin Chuzzlewit's disillusionment. The quotation from Dickens' American Notes, also written after his return, describes his first experience of the steamship RMS Britannia in the docks in Liverpool, describing his realization that perhaps the holiday brochure describing the ship he was to travel in did not tend to exaggerate its luxury. His luggage, he said, could no more be got in at the door, not to say stowed away, than a giraffe could be persuaded or forced into a flower pot. He went off to the Adelphi Hotel and had a big slap-up meal of turtle soup. And then by that time he calmed down and went back to the ship and had an awful journey over to America, but he didn't want to go on the same ship on the way back. So in 1842, he travelled with his wife Catherine and their servant Anne Brown and was greeted like a modern-day rock star. Adulation, though, was to turn sour after the publication of Martin Chuzzlewit when he got back and his American Notes, outlining the things he didn't like about the experience. And these were the constant crowds following him, the shared meals with no privacy, the commercialism. He was apparently followed down the street by people with scissors wanting to cut off locks of his hair to sell. The potential for violence with everyone carrying guns. And what he saw as poor hygiene and the universal habit of spitting tobacco everywhere. Mind you, he didn't endear himself to his hosts either by using some of his speaking opportunities to attack the abuses of copyright when his novels were published without his permission. He travelled by steamboat, stagecoach and railway as far west as St. Louis, as far north as Quebec and as far south as Richmond, Virginia. He should have travelled to Charleston as well, but called off his tour there because he witnessed the thing he found most objectionable about America, namely slavery. Now, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished by an Act of Parliament in 1807, but slavery across the British Empire was not abolished in practice until 1838, 5 years after the passing of the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. Dickens, though, is scathing in his condemnation in his American Notes. He devotes a whole chapter to it. And in Martin Chuzzlewit, the character of Mr. Chollop, who they meet in Eden, is ridiculed as someone who always introduced himself to strangers as a worshipper of freedom, was a consistent advocate of lynch law and slavery, and invariably recommended, both in print and speech, the tarring and feathering of any unpopular person who differed from himself. Sorry, that was an American accent. So that was Martin Chuzzlewit. Now, neither Barnaby Rudge nor Martin Chuzzlewit sold well, and his publishers were beginning to think that their boy genius had run out of steam. Charles Dickens' next venture was to disabuse them of that belief and earn him the accolade as the man who invented Christmas. And of course, we all know it's then that he wrote A Christmas Carol. A squeezing, a wrenching, a grasping, a scraping, a clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The story of the misanthropic miser who is visited by the ghost of his former partner and 3 other ghosts before he undergoes a poor line conversion, perhaps appropriately, is familiar to us all. Whether we've been brought up on John Leach's illustrations as here, or Alistair Sims, or Donald Duck, or the Muppets, all of whom have retold the story in their unique way. The book was a publishing sensation then and ever since, and it can be said to have saved Dickens' career. And what better opening line to a novel could you have than Marley was dead to begin with? There was a recent film about Dickens which described him, according to the title, as the man who invented Christmas. And there's some truth in this. You only have to look at your Christmas cards to see The Harsh Winter of 1843 or Wish Someone a Merry Christmas, first used by Dickens, to see his influence. He was also tapping into the spirit of the age. And we can mention things like the penny post had been in operation since 1840-43. Henry Cole had begun the custom of sending Christmas cards with 1,000 hand-printed cards. Growth of the railways also contributed to the rapid distribution. The first Christmas cracker was 1841. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert popularized and made respectable such things as the Christmas tree and the giving of presents to children, servants, and the poor. Dickens' own Christmases were always a highlight of the year for his family, with games, presents, and the traditional turkey and plum pudding we find in A Christmas Carol. The Cratchit family first had a goose, but at the end of the book, Ebenezer Scrooge gives them a turkey, which was becoming more fashionable. Dickens' family are also recorded to have had a turkey for Christmas in 1843. The success of A Christmas Carol meant that Dickens would write a further 4 Christmas stories, to which we can add the story of the goblins who stole a sexton in the Pickwick Papers, making 5. So here we see Dickens having returned from Genoa, where he'd spent the best part of the year between 1844 and 1845, entertaining his friends at the home of John Foster, seated to the left. It's in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and they're reading The Chimes in 1844. The engraving was done by another close friend, the artist Daniel Maclise, and includes Thomas Carlyle, Clarkson Stanfield, and his brother Frederick with his back to us. The other 3 Christmas books were The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man or The Ghost's Bargain. It is, of course, not just a jolly old Christmas story. There's a seriousness behind the jollity, a message, a warning about the effects of the Industrial Revolution on the urban poor. Here portrayed as want and ignorance by John Leach, and then on the right-hand side, the contemporary Bulgarian artist Krastyo Todorov. Dickens had been asked to write a pamphlet after a visit to the slums of Manchester, but chose to write his novella instead. He wrote to one of the commissioners of the Parliamentary Report who had asked him to contribute with the words, "You will certainly feel that a sledgehammer has come down with 20 times the force, 20,000 times the force I could exert by following out my first idea." And after all these years, who could argue with that? Dickens' next novel, number 8, it's his 7th novel, but 8 in this list after the short stories, was begun in 1846 and completed in 1848, in the year of revolutions, and in the month when 25,000 Chartists gathered on Kensington Common to present their petition for universal suffrage. 200,000 had been expected, and London had prepared by bringing in the military and swearing in 170,000 special constables, of whom Dickens was one. He didn't approve of organised labour, but he was a social reformer in other ways, so I suppose we can let him off. Dombey and Son should really be called Dombey and Daughter, because it's as much about the neglect of poor Florence Dombey as of the sickly son who dies young. The young Paul Dombey was based on his nephew, Fanny's son, who, like Fanny, died later in 1848. It contains such interesting characters as the Captain Cuttle, who owns a chandler's shop, Mr. Blimbers, who owns a school, and the horrible old lady, Mrs. Pipchin, pictured there, and the villainous Mr. Carker. It also contains the first death in literature by being run over by a steam train, and this wonderfully onomatopoeic description of a railway journey, which I will let you read, I think, and follow up. It's chapter 20 of Dombey and Son. It's beautifully onomatopoeically written. 1848 was also the year that Dickens set up one of his pet philanthropic projects with the help of the banking heiress Angela Burdett Coutts. This was Urania House in Shepherd's Bush, which was to give a place of refuge and training in domestic skills to fallen women, and to prepare them for marriage or work as servants. There were estimated to be as many as 80,000 prostitutes in London alone, with many more women made homeless for having a child out of wedlock. Little Emily and David Copperfield, and Nancy and Oliver Twist were two who had fallen into prostitution, but with whom Dickens wants the reader to sympathise, as does Rossetti in the painting he began in 1853 and never finished. Dickens was also an investigative journalist. By nature, he was both investigative and campaigning all his life. Whenever he travelled, he would visit prisons, hospitals, asylums, ragged schools, and with a police escort, the slums at night. We all know he did this in London, but in the early months of 1860, he visited Liverpool to investigate firstly the lives of the poor, and secondly, the scandalous mistreatment of the soldiers of the East India Company sent home from India in the most appalling conditions. They ended up in the hospital ward of the Liverpool Workhouse, the site on which was built the Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King, for which, by the way, he is full of praise. That's the workhouse, not Christ the King, saving his scorn and condemnation for the callous and Panglossian government departments who allowed this to happen. And their stories were published in All the Year Round, the magazine he owned and edited, the successor to Household Words, and published later in a collection of essays under the title of The Uncommercial Traveller. The first was published on the 10th of March 1860 and describes his night tour of the courts adjacent to the Liverpool docks, escorted by the local police. And the second is about the Tasmania's bedraggled cargo of dead and dying former soldiers. I'll take a drink while you have a quick read of that. Dickens' favourite and most autobiographical novel, though readers didn't realise it at the time, was David Copperfield. It contains not only the child's sense of abandonment, being sent out to work, here at the age of 10 rather than 12, and at a bottling rather than a boot-blacking factory. It contains the shame of the debtor's prison, a spendthrift character like his own father, who himself we can imagine saying, "Annual income £20, annual expenditure £19, 19 shillings and sixpence, result happiness. Annual income £20 and annual expenditure £20, ought and six, result misery." It also contains the obsequious and evil Uriah Heep, and a childish, silly girl, Dora, who is clearly based on Mary Beadnell. Here is the brutal Mr. Murdstone, whose name requires only a modicum of French to appreciate what we're meant to feel about him, who beats David mercilessly in the early chapters of the book. But the one doing the beating is Mr. Micawber beating Uriah Heep, and he certainly deserved it. It's often been speculated whether Dickens ever did beat his children, as would perhaps be expected of a Victorian parent. Apparently he did not. When the Dickens went off to America for 4 months in January 1842, they left their first 4 children behind, the youngest Walter under a year old, in the care of Georgina Hogarth, the next of Catherine's sisters to join the household, and Frederick Dickens, the brother. On other occasions, they were known to have begged their parents not to leave them with the Macreadys, the famous actor, because they were noticeably stricter. Over a 16-year period, Catherine gave birth to 10 children and had at least 2 miscarriages. The girls Mary, Mamie, 1838, and Catherine, Katie, 1839, were given family names, while Dora, who died after only 8 months, was named after this character of the same name in David Copperfield. With the exception of Charlie, 1837, the eldest, who was also given the name Boz, the boys were given the names of people with a literary association: Walter Savage Landor, Francis Jeffrey, Alfred Dorsey Tennyson, Sidney Smith Haldeman, Henry Fielding, and Edward Bulwer Lytton. In addition, Dickens delighted in giving his children nicknames, most notably Lucifer Box for Katie, who had a bit of a temper, Chicken Stalker for Francis, and Plawn for Edward. In later life, they would between them fill the roles of banker and businessman, lieutenant in the East India Company, a Canadian Mountie, a Royal Navy officer who died at the age of 25, a lawyer, and a Liberal MP for New South Wales in a place called Australia. Bleak House was the 9th novel. Dickens experimented here with 2 voices, that of an omniscient third-person narrator and that of Esther Summerson, an orphan whose cruel upbringing makes her self-effacing. But she emerges as a strong character who discovers her true identity in the course of the book. The novel is memorable for its atmospheric opening of cloying mud and fog, which exactly parallels the never-ending legal cases being enacted in the Court of Chancery for Joe the Crossing Sweeper, one of Dickens' child victims, the cold, haughty and secretive Lady Dedlock, and the evil lawyer Mr. Tulkinghorn, whose house model on John Foster's at Lincoln Inn Fields we've met already. One of the first detectives in English fiction, Inspector Bucket, and A Case of Spontaneous Combustion, which kills Crook, a rag and bottle merchant who holds the key to Esther Summerson's past. Apparently, Dickens thought it was scientific fact. 1852, the year in which Dickens began serializing Bleak House, was also for him a year in which he was able to indulge his favourite passion of amateur dramatics. As a young man in London, he was an avid theatre goer who might well have become an actor himself, like Nicholas Nickleby, had he not been unwell on the day of his audition at Drury Lane. He made up for it by acting and directing wherever and whenever he could, including a private performance in Montreal, Canada, during his American tour. He was obviously good at it, as critics frequently pointed out, and as the stage carpenter at the Haymarket said after watching a performance, "Oh, Mr. Dickens, it was a sad loss to the public when you took to writing." He performed all over the country, ostensibly to raise money for a variety of causes. He, for example, is credited with saving Shakespeare's Stratford home for the nation when in 1847 he was instrumental in outbidding Phineas T. Barnum, who wanted to put it on a wagon and trail it across the United States. But really, he did it because he enjoyed it. Those are pictures of his performances in Liverpool. One play he both directed and performed in would have life-changing consequences. This was The Frozen Deep, written in collaboration with his friend Wilkie Collins to celebrate the heroism of the Franklin expedition, which had been lost in the Arctic while trying to find the Northwest Passage. Reports had come in from the local Inuits that the bodies that had been discovered showed signs of cannibalism, and Dickens, rather jingoistically, was trying to refute this with a romantic tale of Victorian derring-do and Englishness. It was first performed on the 7th of January 1857 at Tavistock House, where he had written Bleak House and had on its cast list not only Dickens and Wilkie Collins, but also his son Alfred and daughters Mamie and Kate. When the play travelled north to Manchester, it would have been improper, of course, to have his daughters perform in public. and so professional actors were hired to take their place. And this was when his problems began. His next novel, though, was Hard Times. The predecessor to Dickens' periodical All the Year Round was Household Words, another title taken from Shakespeare. Hard Times was published in this periodical in weekly instalments in 1854. It was written after another investigation into the working lives of the urban poor, this time in Preston, Lancashire, which he called Coketown in the novel. Here is Mr. Gradgrind, appalled by his two children, Tom and Louisa, peering through a fence to look at a circus, how dare they, a metaphor for the world of the imagination, which is denied to them under the fact-based Gradgrind system of education favoured by the appropriately named teacher, Mr. Machoakumchild. I know the feeling. It's a story of industrial relations and exploitation, but not one where organised labour is shown in a positive light. The tragic hero is called Stephen Blackpool, which is appropriate for somewhere near Preston. The Frozen Deep. Meanwhile, Dickens, who had met Wilkie Collins in 1851, but by 1855 had travelled with him to Paris and no doubt visited some more seedier places with him. It was shortly after that they collaborated on the play of The Frozen Deep. It was first performed, as we've seen, in the respectable converted schoolroom of Tavistock House in January 1857. He had grown a beard for the part of Mr. Wardour and would keep this for the rest of his life. When the play moved to Manchester, the parts of Lucy, Clara and the nurse were taken by members of an acting family, a mother and her two daughters, the Turtons. It was then that Dickens fell in love with the actress Ellen Ternan. She was 18 and Dickens was 45. Nelly, as she was known, was the third child actor of the Thomas Lawless, who had died in an asylum, and she had been born in 1839 in Rochester. From that moment, he was to begin a clandestine affair, which would lead to his separation from Catherine, the breakup of long-term friendships with people like Thackeray, and a row with his publishers, which led him to change from Household Words to All the Year Round, as we've seen. The scandal broke when Thackeray had attempted to defend Dickens at his club, the Garrick. He'd been accused of having an incestuous relationship with his sister-in-law, Georgina. Thackeray, in his defence, had blurted out that, no, it was an actress. Dickens would issue a strongly worded denial in the Times, which blamed and shamed Catherine as a poor mother and denied any impropriety on his part. He fell out with his publishers Bradbury and Evans when they refused to publish his cruel statement in Punch, and he didn't speak to Thackeray again for many years. The story of Ellen Ternan and Dickens is told very well in Claire Tomlin's account, The Invisible Woman, which was also made into a film. Catherine was first to find out about the affair in the spring of 1858, when a bracelet intended as a present for Ellen Ternan was mistakenly delivered to her. Their separation soon followed in May 1858, and Catherine moved out of the two family houses. Novel number 11. In Dickens' 11th full novel, Dickens returned to the painful memory of the Marshalsea and gave us such memorable characters as the aptly named government official, Mr. Tite Barnacle. No more, it seems. The orphaned and hot-tempered Tattycoram, and the evil, multi-named wife murderer Rigaud. This time, the incumbent of the debtor's prison is William Dorrit, the father of a devoted daughter, Amy, who falls in love with Arthur Clenham. William Dorrit has been imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison for over 20 years. Next to the Marshalsea was the Church of St. George the Martyr, which Dickens would have known, and in which little Dorrit has to spend the night in the vestry with her head resting on the parish registry of births and deaths. And today you can still visit the church next to the one remaining wall of the Marshalsea that still exists. And if you look carefully at the stained glass window over the high altar, you'll see a representation of Amy Dorrit, and she's just at the feet, a small figure at the feet of St. George. Now, Amy Dorrit is one of those self-sacrificing angel in the house types that Dickens seemed to have found so attractive. Here are also Rosa Budd from The Mystery of Edwin Drude, wonderfully pretty, wonderfully childlike, Agnes Wickfield in David Copperfield, Florence Dombey, Kate in Nicholas Nickleby, Lucy Manette in A Tale of Two Cities, Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop, and Rose Maylie in Oliver Twist. His real life equivalent of these young women before Nelly Ternan was Maria Beadnell, who we've already met and who inspired another childish character, Dora Spenlow, in David Copperfield. She appears again in Little Dorrit as Flora Finching, the once delightful young thing who Arthur Clenham had fallen in love with. Her reappearance several years later as the less than perfect middle-aged woman of Dickens' caricature, grown to be very broad and short of breath, diffuse and silly, spoiled and artless, mirrored his own meeting with Maria in the year that he began writing this novel. Catherine, after so many children, had also lost her youthful looks and was ripe for supplanting by the younger woman. After their separation, she moved to another part of London with a £600 settlement fee, no compensation, of course, for the loss of her family. Even her sister Georgina stayed loyal to Dickens rather than her. Only her eldest child, Charles Culliford Boz Dickens, now 21, defied his father's injunction not to see their mother ever again. And there are sad stories of Katie and Mamie taking piano lessons very near to the 70 Gloucester Crescent residence where Catherine lived, but never deigning to visit as she watched them from the window. Both Katie and Mamie were heartbroken by the separation. Mamie never married, but Kate soon found escape in marriage, first with Charles Alston Collins, the sickly and most likely homosexual brother of Wilkie Collins, in 1860. And then in 1873, the lover of her life, the painter Carlo Perugini. Her story is told by the great-great-granddaughter of Henry Fielding Dickens, Lucinda Hawksley, with one of my favourite paintings, the Black Bronze Wicket by Millais, for which she modelled on the cover. Book 12. Significantly, his next novel, A Tale of Two Cities, was published in his own weekly periodical all the year round, after he'd ended the association with his publishers Bradbury and Evans, who had part ownership of Household Words. This was Dickens' second historical novel, this time set against the background of the French Revolution, with the dissipated lawyer Sidney Carton, who redeems himself at the novel's end. It contains one of the most famous opening lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and the best closing speeches. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done, in English literature at least. Beginning in 1858, Dickens began to throw his energies into his public reading tours, which would continue for the next 12 years. They were both an outlet for his acting talents, a lucrative addition to his fortune, and no doubt both a distraction from his family woes and an opportunity on many an occasion for a liaison with Miss Turner. He travelled all over Britain, but if he had to perform A Tale in Two Cities, they would have had to be London and Liverpool, which he acknowledged as his favourites. St George's Hall in Liverpool was indeed one of his favourite venues. His public readings were a sellout wherever he went, and his reading was so powerful that women were known to faint and men burst into tears. In 1867, the Civil War now ended, Dickens undertook his second 4-month tour of America, this time with a strong emphasis on his public readings. This time he travelled only as far south as Washington, as far north as Portland, Maine, and as far west as Buffalo in New York State. He was again greeted with adulation wherever he went. America seemed to have forgotten his harsh criticisms after the 1842 tour. And he met such American literary greats as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. Mark Twain also attended one of his readings in New York, a first date with his future wife, and wrote a rare critical review, but perhaps not quite as critical as his assessment of Jane Austen. When Dickens returned to Liverpool on the 23rd of April, 1868, it is likely that Nelly Turner was there on the dockside waiting for him. And my favourite Dickens is novel, at least, is Great Expectations, which began weekly serialisation in all the year round on the 1st of December 1860. For the opening scene of the story, he went back to his childhood memory of walking along the Medway, seeing the prison hulks, and then up to the church at Coolidge with the lozenge gravestones. So there were also a feature at his local church of St Mary's Higham when he moved back to Kent. There's no part of my literary holiday leading that I've enjoyed more than taking guests to this spot and reading an extract from the opening chapter of the novel. I don't know whether they enjoy it, but I certainly do. Here is where the orphaned Pip is surprised at the graveside of his parents and 5 brothers who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early and that universal struggle, to quote the novel. And here's David Lean's portrayal of Magwitch, which really captures the terror of the small child's encounter, I think. Or again, David Lean, the haughty disdain of Estella, whom he mistakenly thinks is responsible for the fortune he inherits. Sattie's house, the home of the spurned lover Miss Havisham, is a truly Gothic setting for a Dickens novel. Interestingly, the ending of the novel was changed on the suggestion of his author friend Edward Bulwer-Lytton after he named one of his child. Now best known for the Edward Bulwer-Lytton Prize for the cliched opening to one of his novels, it was a dark and stormy night, and the subsequent Rotten Tomatoes type annual prize associated with it. Dickens' secret liaison with Nelly Turner continued, but was nearly exposed by the Staplehurst train crash of the 9th of June 1865. Nelly was returning to London on the boat train after a trip to Boulogne, with both Dickens and her mother sharing her carriage. They escaped relatively unscathed in a derailment that killed 10 and left 30 injured. Having seen to the Turnans, Dickens then went to attend to the dying and injured, and then to rescuing the manuscript of his next novel from the now precariously positioned carriage in which they had been travelling. He was pictured in the Illustrated News administering brandy to one of the injured, but refused to attend the inquest to avoid further exposure for obvious reasons. The couple had had a love nest at Condette in the Pas-de-Calais department, and he had, according to some reports, fathered a child by her, which died young. He would continue to visit and support her for the rest of his life in various locations in the south of England, including Slough, pictured here. After his death, she took some years off her age, married a schoolmaster, and settled down in Portsmouth, where she died in 1914. She is buried in Highfield Cemetery, Portsmouth, where I like to take people. And by one of those strange twists of fate, only a few hundred yards from the grave of one of Mrs. Maria Winter. There's Nelly Robinson. A few hundred yards away is the grave of one Mrs. Maria Winter, née Beadnell, who had died 28 years earlier. So they're very close together. The final completed novel, but it's penultimate one, was Our Mutual Friend, the manuscript he risked his life to save. The novel begins with Gaffer Hexam and his daughter Lizzie, the heroine of the novel, looking for drowned corpses floating in the Thames between London Bridge and Southwark Bridge. Their intention is to steal money from their pockets. The panel on the left shows a scene in the taxidermist shop of Mr. Venus, who teams up with Silas Wegg, the amputee in front of the fire, in an attempted blackmail of Mr. Boffin. The love interest in the novel is provided, among others, by the vivacious Bella Wilfer, pictured there, regarded by many critics as modelled on Ellen Ternan herself. When Dickens was not travelling or being entertained by Nelly Turner, he was living in this house at Gad's Hill. He'd acquired the house in 1856, but moved his family there permanently from 1860. He was thrilled by his purchase, not only because of its Shakespearean associations, but also because it was near his childhood home in Chatham. It was indeed the very same house that his father had pointed out to him and promised that such a house might be his if he worked hard. Today it's a private school and only occasionally open to the public. The bell tower in the middle of the picture features in A Christmas Carol when describing Scrooge's school days, while the porch features in a picture of Kate, her sister Mamie, her husband Charles Alston Collins, and Wilkie Collins. The man standing is H.F. Chorley, literary critic and friend of Dickens. The porch and the corridor leading to it remain unchanged today. That's the one at the bottom right. The view from the front study out into the front garden is the one Dickens would have known. This engraving by Samuel Hollier shows Dickens in his study with all the paraphernalia he needed for writing, goose quill pens and blue ink, a vase of fresh flowers, a large paper knife, a gilt leaf with a rabbit perched upon it, and two bronze statuettes, a gentleman surrounded by puppies, and the two dueling toads you can make out in front of the window. He demanded absolute silence, and the children had to be very on the best behaviour. But Mamie recalled that on one time she was allowed into his study to sit quietly on the floor behind him, and she found that he was animated, acting out the parts of the characters he was writing about. The bookcases took impressive titles, look impressive, but one of them is a false door, and another contains 37 joke titles, such as Lady Godiva on the Horse and Hansard's Guide to Refreshing Sleep, and rather cruelly perhaps, Miss Biffin on Deportment. She was a Victorian portrait painter who had no arms. She's also buried in Liverpool, by the way. His desk is, which is on the right there, is now in the Museum of London. And we come to his last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, unfinished at his death with only 6 of the proposed 12 editions serialized. The story is set in and around the cathedral city of Rochester, but it begins when John Jasper leaves a London opium den. The arrival of the landless twins and the disappearance of the eponymous Edwin Drood cast suspicion on Neville Landless, but John Jasper, the presenter and choirmaster who is in love with the young and childish Rosa Budd, looks the most likely suspect and doesn't look too impressed in this picture with his advances. The beautifully named Hiram Grugius, the lawyer and the guardian of Rosa Budd, doesn't look too impressed either at John Jasper's sudden collapse on hearing that the engagement of Edwin Drood and Rosa Budd has been called off. Collapsing from relief, I would have thought. Dickens set his final novel in a city he knew well, here making the Eastgate House the seminary for young ladies that Rosa Budd and Helena Landless attend, and the gatehouse shown here, the home of John Jasper. And here is Satie's house, which you probably recognise from Great Expectations. 3 days before his death, he was seen in the gardens known as the Vine, looking over the gate at Restoration House, which is this one, the model for Satie's house in Great Expectations. The name is taken from another house within the city. So perhaps intended as a location in the next instalment of Edwin Drood. On the evening of Wednesday, the 8th of June, 1870, Dickens had been working in the garden chalet, which had been a present from his French actor friend, Charles Fector, 4 years before. Now, there's a tunnel from Dickens' front garden under the road, which emerges in the garden opposite, which he owned as well. And it's here that the chalet was located, though now it's behind Eastgate House in Rochester. He came into the house to have his dinner, but suffered a stroke and died at 6:10 on the evening of the following day, in the evening. Now, there is speculation that he died in Nelly Turnant's house in London and was driven to Gad's Hill to cover up the scandal, but this now seems unlikely. In his will, he left £1,000 legacy for Nelly so that she would never have to work again, and the bulk of the rest to his sister-in-law, Georgina Hogarth, who had remained faithful to him to the end and was present when he died. The painter Samuel Luke Files, who had been the illustrator for Edwin Drood, created this most famous painting of the empty chair in 1870. And another famous painting is that by Robert Buss, called Dickens' Dream, where Dickens is seen sleeping surrounded by his characters, and that was painted in 1875. While Dickens' preference was to be buried in Rochester, either in front of the castle or the cathedral opposite it, as the nation's favourite author, a bit like Hardy, I suppose, he was buried in Westminster Abbey instead. He was also not very keen to have any statue erected in his honour. He said, "I conjure to my friends on no account to make me the subject of any monument, memorial or testimonial whatsoever. I rest my claims to the remembrance of my country upon my published works." But the good people of Portsmouth and Philadelphia on the right-hand side thought better of it. His monument remains his published works, which are still enjoyed today. But if you want to see a more visual celebration of Dickens, go to Rochester in June, when the good people of Rochester dress up for the day. Enjoy the commemoration of his memory and the characters who still live among us. Just like that. They still do that to this day. And what might Dickens have said about all those characters, all that fuss? I'll tell you. Bar humbug, no doubt. And with that, I rest my case.